Today we're getting back onto the E30 project and I'm going to start addressing some of the problems I was whinging about in that previous driving video. Just to briefly recap, the problems I was having are mostly around the harshness of how the car drives. It's just a bit more race car than I wanted it to be based on how I intend to actually use this car. If you watch the previous video, the driving video, you may get a feel for what I'm talking about by that harshness. But I outlined 4 potential changes that I'd like to make to this car just to tone it down. Firstly was the map to get rid of the pots and pans effect, softer suspension, a longer ratio diff, and a change to the exhaust to just make it a bit less resonating. I've actually got some new and exciting parts to share with you, but before we get onto that, let me tell you about a couple of other problems I had with the car since the filming of that previous video. Maybe the car didn't like the criticism I was giving it and it was getting its revenge. If you've been following along with the build, you'll remember the cooling setup where I installed the larger E36 radiator and mounted a nice 16-inch spout pusher fan to the front. I thought I'd actually done a really great job of that. If anything, I thought it was overkill the way I'd mounted it with aluminium angle. But sadly, the fan has self-destructed. I'll overlay some shots of the aftermath now. I'm not really sure how it happened, possibly related to the suspension being so stiff over bumps that the blades of the fan might have flexed and caught on that aluminium strip that I'd mounted it on. The blades then snapped off, a couple of them anyway, and wedged themselves into the rad, jamming the fan, blowing the fuse. Luckily, the car didn't overheat. I was surprised how stable the temperature was without a fan actually. It didn't even get towards the red as I was driving the car home to park it up, although that might have been a different story in traffic, so I was probably quite lucky with that. I've already fitted a new spout fan, exactly the same one, another 90 quid cost on the build unfortunately. I've also made a modification to the aluminium mounts to ensure the blades have more clearance. And that, so far, having driven it a bit since, seems to have solved it. I have not destroyed another fan. If you've copied the way I mounted this fan, I would urge you to have a look and modify it in the same way I have, just giving the blades a bit more clearance. Amusingly, as I opened the bonnet to investigate the fan situation, I then found the bonnet would not close again. I could push it and it just would not catch on the latch. From investigation, it seems like the 2 bolts that I'd secured the latch to the front core support with, I probably hadn't torqued up enough, so the latch had slipped down and it was not biting on the hook on the bonnet. Thank God the E30's bonnet opens the wrong way, or that would have had to be a very careful drive home so the bonnet didn't slap the windscreen. A quick tighten up and that was fixed, which is great news. Lastly, one of the 2 rear exhaust brackets I'd fitted had snapped on the rear muffler. If you recall, these were stainless steel aftermarket ones I'd picked up on eBay. Unfortunately, I didn't get the Scorpion ones with the exhaust. I think they are good quality, but the way I've had to use them to work with the E30's mounting points was suboptimal, and it caused stress on the strap, and it just snapped. Luckily, there doesn't seem to be any further damage. I used a bit of rope to get the E30 back home again, which worked completely fine. And I've now picked up some OE style exhaust brackets with fresh rubbers. They sadly aren't stainless, and of course they don't fit the colossal Scorpion backbox, but I modified them to extend them and it seems to have worked really well. I'm actually much happier with how it's mounted now, and I'm wondering if these different mounts will actually help with the exhaust sound issues. I'll overlay a little sequence now so you can see how I've modified the original clamps to work on this car. I can't start the car right now because in other news I've actually sent the ECU off to Dan at BM Conversions UK to put his map onto it. The ECU I was running on this car was actually one I just picked up on eBay, probably some map from a drift car which included that burble tune that's given me the pots and pans effect that I just cannot live with. So hopefully the car's going to run a lot better with Dan's tune on it and there's not going to be any of that pat 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 nonsense that I can't stand. Now you're up to speed, let's talk about the exciting new parts that I mentioned earlier. This is a medium case 3.64 limited slip diff. I actually took the advice of most people who commented in going for the 3.64. It seems like that should be the ideal compromise for my setup using the 318 IS gearbox. It looks pretty crusty on the outside because it's been sat around in the back of someone's garage for the past 10 years, but it seems smooth to turn and it doesn't even appear to have any leaks. Apparently it came off a 325i Sport with around 90,000 miles on it around 10 years ago. The guy I got it from used to break E30s, and for some reason he hung on to this diff. Hopefully that's an indication that it's a good one. It was bloody expensive, but after a bit of hard negotiation, I only ended up paying around twice what I'd previously paid for an E30 limited slip diff, so with today's prices, it wasn't outrageous. Let's give this diff a bit of a glow up, starting with a good clean. I'll crack it open, and if all looks well inside, we'll give it a fresh coat of paint, a new bushing, and get ready to put it on. Buckle up, this is bound to get very messy. final torque, 33 Newton meters or 24 foot-pound. We'll be putting a stop to the one tyre fire with this. So with the differential, it should be 5 fasteners for the diff and also taking off the half shafts and the prop shaft, and then it should fall out like the M3s did.
Brake on.
Handbrake on.
What brake on?
Okay. Oh, it's on the move. It'll stop being
That
caught
mount
on
at
that.
the back is in that slot
What slot?
where the bush goes.
It's sliding out of the slot.
Right, well when it comes out then it'll go backwards and fall on your head. Are you ready?
Yeah,
Right,
got it.
lower
Yeah.
in.
Go on.
You want to keep your hands on it.
Oh, right. Right, it's out of the back clasp thing. Right, keep going. I need to pull it backwards. Right, okay. Now it's only on the jack.
Right, coming down. Watch your teeth.
Steady on, steady on.
What's that, Ash?
Yeah. Lovely job. With the small case open diff now on the bench next to the medium case limited slip, it's a great opportunity to actually point out the differences between E30 diffs so you can actually identify one correctly. First thing to note is they are interchangeable. The output flanges and the input flange on both medium and small case are in the same position, so you don't need to change your drive shafts. You can easily interchange these between E30s without a problem. The medium case, aka 188, I think the 188 stands for the crown wheel size, 168, small case, smaller crown wheel size. It's probably obvious just on sight that the medium case is physically larger, but that's most obvious where you look at the output flanges. You can see the output flanges are pushed out quite away on the small case, but they're almost up to the body on the medium case. Also, you can see that the output flanges where they join the body have different number of bolts. On these, there's 6 bolts holding this part on. On here, there's only 4, but of course the actual flange itself identical. Even more obvious is when you look at the back plates. On the small case, there are 6 bolts holding on the back plate, and on the medium case, there are 8 bolts holding on the back plate. As for identifying whether a diff is limited slip or not, you are looking out for the S. Worth noting, you can get limited slip in both small case and medium case. The S you're looking for stands for Sperr, which is lock in German, and the S will be found on the tags. All the diffs have tags, and the limited slip ones have an S prefix before the ratio. So this one is S 3.64 and this one just says 4.27. There will also be an S painted on a limited slip diff in white. However, they've almost all rusted off by now, so you won't often see those anymore. Another way to tell would be how the diff behaves to inputs. For example, open diff, I can hold an output flange and turn the input flange and it will just turn that on, or I can do that and it'll turn in the opposite direction. Whereas with a limited slip, they want to turn the same way and I cannot stop one of the output flanges from turning by hand. And if all else fails when you're trying to identify a diff you're buying, crack open the back plate and you'll see there's a cylindrical enclosure for the limited slip diff, which is probably going to be stamped S25 for 25% or S40. On an open diff, you can see the spider gears and there's not a cylindrical enclosure. I'll overlay a picture so you can know what you're looking at. But that's how you identify the different types of E30 diffs. As for oil, the small case diff takes 0.9 litres and the medium case takes 1.7 litres, so quite a bit more. An open diff would take 75-90 and a limited slip takes 75-140 limited slip specific oil, or Castrol B373, which is what I've picked up for this one. Well, that's literally everything I know about E30 differentials. Please add a comment if there's anything else useful I should have added to that. But for now, I'm going to shut up and we're actually going to fit this medium case limited slip diff on the car. Decided to pour the oil in on the bench rather than underneath the car. Even though it'll make the diff slightly heavier, it's just so much easier doing it on a bench. Good work. Well, that's the diff on and I've got it all tightened up real good. I've got news from Driftworks, who are the suppliers of my HSD Monopro coilovers. I've been back and forth with their support to try and find out what spring rates they actually supplied me all the way back when I did my 5 lug swap. Unfortunately, they seem to have made some changes to the kit and they're no longer sure what spring rates they'll have actually supplied. I went with the middle stiffness. The theory, of course, is that now I've wound the dampers all to full soft, the ride is still too harsh due to the fact the springs are probably too stiff. Not knowing exactly which ones they are is a bit of an issue, but they did give me some recommendations. First being, take all the preload off the coilover springs. The rear has no preload. The front has, I think I put 5mm of preload on the spring, so I'm going to take that preload completely off. I think while I'm at it, I'm also going to see if I can raise the car maybe by 0.5 centimetre at the front, because I'm sick of putting this front lip back on, which gets half knocked off every time I go on the drive. So let's take off the coilover covers and get these adjusted. So this is where I applied the preload on the spring, and as you can see the spring's held fairly firmly captive. However, I did only put the coilover spanner width of preload onto this spring, which is about 1/2 centimetre. Very little. I've got to be honest, I'm really not expecting this change to make the slightest bit of difference, but I'm going to take Driftworks' advice anyway and do it. So I'm going to loosen off the locking collar, then I'm going to loosen off the collar that's putting the spring under compression so it rattles, and then I'm just going to tighten up this collar so it takes any rattle away from the spring but no compression on it. Then I'm going to lock these two rings back together, and then I'm going to have no preload on this spring. So that's the spring fully loose. So I'm going to dial it up now just so there's no up and down play. So that's perfect. Now let's get them locked back on. So with that done, now I'm going to change the ride height. I'm only going to add 1/2 centimetre of height to this strut, which doesn't sound like a lot, and it isn't, but it will just improve the scraping problem I've got and just make life a bit easier. Bloody hell, I've done a good job of tightening that last time. There we go. I've got that nice and tight now, so I'm going to go around and get the other side done to the same specs, and then I'll probably go around and have a final tighten before I put these coilover covers back on. Well, it definitely looks slightly higher, and there's less rake now, which is probably a good thing. Now, when I was removing the preload off the springs, even though I knew it was only 5mm, it did feel like I took a fair amount of tension off the springs. So whilst my expectations are still low for it actually improving the ride quality, you never know, it might actually have more of an impact than I think. While I've been doing that, have a look what's turned up back. The ECU, super quick turnaround from Dan at BM Conversions UK. Really hoping this solves my pots and pans, pops and bangs problem. I don't know an awful lot about the map. Obviously it'll be Dan's proprietary formula, but it should be the perfect map for this car really, with the M50 manifold tuned to suit. So I'm going to chuck this on, and then we can go for a test drive and see if my 3 changes have actually had an impact. They do say you should change only one thing at a time to see the difference, but here we are. Right, ECU back in where it belongs, just under here. You didn't want to watch me lying upside down in the footwell again. You might be able to tell, but this knee roll, which was already knackered, gets worse every time I take it off. And now I've resorted to adding a bit of gaffer tape for extra insurance. But the first test of this ECU is, will the car still start now the ECU map's been changed? I'm sure it will, but this car is full of surprises. Looks very promising. I should mention, by the way, if you are looking for any parts really for engine converted E30, do get in touch with Dan at BM Conversions UK. There's nothing he doesn't really know about E30 swaps, and he can definitely sort you out with a good map as well. I will put a link to him in the description. Check him out, get in touch if you need a map of your own. been using the E30 for a few days now to really get a feel for the changes that I made. First thing to mention is my 16-inch SPAL pusher fan, my replacement, is still intact. If you copied the mounts I did originally, I strongly urge you to modify them in the same way I have. Also, my new exhaust mounts, the OE style ones I extended to work with the Scorpion, are much better. It's definitely not moving around enough to clang on anything or anything like that. I should have just done it like that in the first place, to be honest. I can recommend doing it that way. Sadly though, the change to the exhaust hangers has not changed the tone of the exhaust. It still feels quite resonaty at certain RPMs. More work to be done with that. Speaking of RPMs, the 3.64 limited slip differential I fitted has actually transformed this car. I was worried because it's such a drastic change from the 4.27 that it'd feel like it took performance away from the car and took the edge off it. And sure, it doesn't accelerate quite as savagely in the low gears, which I expected to be the case. However, you feel like you're in the correct gear now. It feels much more natural, the pairing between the diff and the gearbox. And I'd make the change again any day of the week. There aren't even any leaks or any new and unwanted differential noises, and to top it off, it even locks up like it should, which I can't help but test repeatedly. That's the second limited slip diff in a row that I've been super lucky with actually, if you watched the M3 video as well. Let's hope that luck continues. As for the suspension, as you know, I was very sceptical that removing the preload off those front springs would make any difference at all. But it actually has made a difference. It's not a massive difference, and the fact I'm still running the dampers on full soft tells me the spring rates are probably still too stiff. But it feels a lot less crashy now I've made that change to the preload. Maybe raising the ride height has helped a little bit with that too. You might have noticed when I set off on that spirited drive, having just changed the ECU, I still have that ridiculous pots and pans burble effect going on. It's just about the same as it was before, and I'm actually really gutted about that because I was confident the problem was solely with the map, and it's probably the main thing spoiling the experience with this car. But I think what that's telling me is it's not the map after all. The map I've got from Dan at BM Conversions is definitely not a burble tune map. So there's something else wrong with the running of this car. Another thing that seems to be implying that is on the new map, the idle speed has now been reduced down to 650 RPM, whereas on the previous map I had, it was set at 900 RPM. With the lower idle speed, the car feels a little bit lumpy when it's ticking over, maybe like there's a slight misfire. And when I go to set off, it kind of stutters a little bit if I'm trying to set off gently. If I'm setting off with gusto, it just takes off. But if I'm setting off gently, it wants to stall on me now, which it didn't before. So I think there may be something wrong with the running of the car that was masked partly by that 900 RPM. When I got back from that drive, I reached out to Dan at BM Conversions again to let him know the bad news about the pots and pans still being present. And he suggested that it might be related to a cam sensor problem, which could explain quite a few things. So if you're interested in finding out if I can finally rid myself of this pots and pans problem, do make sure you subscribe, because we aren't going to be defeated by it. But anyway, thank you very much for watching. Hope you've enjoyed the video.